Lepo pozdravljeni. Tokrat se pogovarjamo z gospodom Erikom Vardenom. Gospod Erik Varden prihaja iz Norveške, je škof v Trondheimu in je seveda tudi trapist. To je red, ki ga v Sloveniji ne poznamo več. Po drugi svetovni vojni so praktično izginili. Razlog, da se pogovarjamo z gospodom Erikom Vardenom je, to sta ti dve knjigi pred mano. Knjigi imata naslov Čistost sprava čutov, besedilo Čistost osvobaja zastarelih in ozkih kategorij, ter jo predstavlja ne le kot vzdržnost, temveč kot pravilno usmerjanje človeške narave, želja in čutov. V tem je novost te knjige in te zamisli gospoda Vardena. Druga knjiga pa je Razbijanje osamljenosti o krščanskem spominjanju. To pa je globok duhovni esej, ki raziskuje univerzalno človeško izkušnjo osamljenosti. In gospod Varden na njo ne gleda kot na bolezen, ki jo je treba ozdraviti, temveč kot na ključ do razumevanja naše identitete in hrepenenja po Bogu. So, Mr. Bishop Erik Varden, it's a great honor to have you in Slovenia.
Pleasure to be here.
Is it your first time?
It is my first time.
What are your impressions?
Well, I've only been here for about 4 hours. But Ljubljana is lovely. And the trip from Trieste this morning was also very nice. I love the mountains.
Perfect. So the two of the books that we are going to introduce, what is the main message and what is the reason why you wrote them?
Well, the main reason I wrote them was that I was invited to write this first book, this one, which in English is called The Shattering of Loneliness. I got a letter about 10 years ago from the commissioning editor of a London publishing house, which is also the publishing house of Harry Potter, saying he wanted to see me. So he came up to the monastery and he said that they would like to invite me to write a book for them.
Really?
And I said, well, what is that supposed to be about? And the editor said, well, I don't know. So we talked for a while, and I told him that I'd just come back from preaching a retreat to a community of Carmelites. And he asked, well, what was the retreat about? And I said, it's about Christian remembrance. It is about the repeated commandment in Scripture to remember. You know, remember you are dust. Remember you were slaves in Egypt. Do this in memory of me, etc. And he got curious and said, tell me more. So I expanded a bit on the theme of this work I'd been doing, and he said, that will work. So that was how that book came about. And I'm delighted that in Slovenian they're published together, because I see them really as two parts of a diptych. And both books are attempts to answer a question, really. What is a human being? And to provide a Christian answer to that question. And that seems to me really the most urgent question of our times. So these two books are two essays that are not a definitive answer, but a particular answer that I hope can perhaps go some way towards feeding people's curiosity, search and questioning, and perhaps give rise to new questions, constructive questions.
So you don't treat loneliness as a disease to be cured, but rather as a key to our identity. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think, I don't know Slovenian, unfortunately. In English, there is, one has the great advantage of having quite a subtle vocabulary when it comes to the experience of being alone. One can speak about loneliness, which is, I think everyone would agree, a negative experience. To be lonely is to feel cut off, isolated, atomized. But you can also speak of solitude. And solitude can be a desirable thing. Solitude can be a state of repose, of attention, of contemplative life, of a deep awareness of being alive. So one thing I try to do in this book is to distinguish between what it is to be lonely and what it is to be solitary. And then to make the point, which I think all of us as human beings run up against the experience of loneliness at some point or other. You know, something happens, a person we know dies, or we go through some experience of loss. You know, we lose a job, we lose our health perhaps, and we suddenly feel terribly delivered to ourselves. And we become aware that we are not sufficient to ourselves, that we don't carry within ourselves all the resources we need in order to live and thrive. So we look for more. And that is where we realize that we are made for fellowship, for friendship, for communion. And we verify in our own experience, you know, what we read in the book of Genesis, it's not good for a human being to be alone. And so we look for companionship on the human level, but also if we're alert to the realm of the spirit, if we believe that we have something deep in us which may be called a soul, we start looking towards God. And thereby, a deep experience of loneliness can be the beginning of a journey of discovery that can lead to a profound experience of connectedness.
So I assume you actually experienced that.
I have some experience of it.
How did you feel? Tell us something about your experience.
Well, I think I, like many other people, went through my teenage years, you know, asking big questions about myself, about life, about the sense of life, about the sense of my longings and desires, and sometimes feeling very cut off. The way, you know, we sometimes use that, the notion of teenage Weltschmerz, when you feel that all the world's pain is on your shoulders. And quite often that term is used ironically. I don't think that is right, because I think what a 14, 15, 16-year-old can feel is extremely real, that you feel all the world's pain on your shoulders. And I had some experience of that. And then I also had some experience of a kind of breakthrough that came to me when I was 15. And it came to me through music. And it was through listening to a symphony by Mahler. And I just stopped earlier on today in the house in Ljubljana in which he lived.
He lived here for 2 years.
And I listened to his second symphony, which is called The Resurrection. And that music, which is also a choral symphony, setting texts that Mahler himself wrote, it pierced something in me, and it made me realize that somehow there was something in me that was greater than I, and that something was real and was somehow personal and somehow must have a name. I didn't really have the courage there and then when I was 15 to call that thing God. But that became the beginning of my own really deliberate spiritual journey. That to some extent is the origin of what I've become.
So you speak about art also in your books. So is the feeling of art also the way to find God?
I think it can be. Obviously, there is art and there is art. You know, there is art which provides pleasure and entertainment, and that's a perfectly licit form of art. And then you have a deeper form of art that takes us to the core of ourselves and makes us discover depths in ourselves that we wouldn't have experienced otherwise. And I think in that sense, you know, literature, music, painting, sculpture for that matter, theater, can all be ways in which God can touch our lives and open both our minds and our perception to the divine mystery.
So why do you think that modern society is so afraid of loneliness, so that we actually try to silence it at all costs?
Well, because loneliness is painful, and no one wants to be lonely. And I think one of the reasons that makes loneliness such a wound in our time is that, you know, our contemporaries have to a very large extent dismissed the hypothesis of transcendence, the hypothesis that there might be some ultimate meaning to existence. And therefore, when we hit that dark depth in ourselves, where we're confronted with our own inner abyss, if I don't believe that there is anything capable of carrying that abyss, well, it will simply seem overwhelming, and I will try to escape from it by means of drugs or sex or entertainment or money spending, whatever it might be, anything to distract me from having to confront my own limitedness.
So the subtitle of the book is On Christian Remembering. Why is memory so important tool for shatter the loneliness?
Well, I chose that path mainly, as I said earlier on, because it is such an important biblical motif. And in my own, one of the main components of monastic life is the practice we call lectio divina, of confronting yourself with the Word of God in Scripture, day by day by day by day, in the early hours of the morning. And in my own Bible reading, I became more and more conscious of the recurrence of this imperative, remember, 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 remember. And why does the Bible tell us so imperatively to remember? Both to remember the greatness that we're capable of. We're asked to remember that we were made in the image of God, to be like God. We are asked to remember that we forfeited and lost that dignity by our collusion with sin. We're asked to remember what it is to be free. We're asked to remember what it is to be a slave. And thereby, by remembering, we're asked to remember ourselves into a context that exceeds our own personal experience, or to read our own personal experience in the light of a greater collective experience. Because the sort of remembrance that Scripture invites us to and the Church invites us to is an invitation to begin to remember with the mind of the whole people of Israel, with the mind of the whole Church. And thereby, remembrance is a way of bursting the bubble of loneliness and remembering myself into a community. So within the context of this Christian memory, how do you understand the role of suffering? So is suffering a necessary part of the path towards healing the memory, or what's the role of the suffering? Well, suffering is simply part and parcel of the human condition, isn't it? I've yet to meet a single human life that has been unmarked by suffering in some form. And no one likes to suffer. And one of the things that faith insists on is that suffering is an anomaly, that we are made to thrive, we are made to be happy, we are made to be free. But our life here and now, and our experience of life, is marked by a deep wound, which Scripture calls sin, which is a kind of disease, or a handicap, or a virus, if you like, that conditions our experience. And to be a human being is to accept the inevitability of sufferings, to accept the fact that I'm not now wholly well. But it's also to believe that God has made me for health and happiness, and that God is providing me with the means to become hale and healthy and to let him heal me. So it is, to be a Christian is at one and the same time to be extremely realistic with regard to life as it is. To be a Christian is not to live on an illusion or to live on a dream, but it is to learn what it is to hope.
The role of the books, each book actually, which is published, not just these two books, is in a way to make a dialogue with the others. So did you succeed to make the dialogue? Because how can a person who might not have a strong religious upbringing, as I suppose you did, how can they enter into your concept of Christian remembering?
Well, the thing is, you see, I didn't really, because my own upbringing was not explicitly Christian.
That's interesting.
I remember what it is to see faith from the outside.
How is it?
And when I was a teenager, I looked at Christianity with a degree of disdain. I thought it was a cheap way out. I didn't think it was convincing at all.
Really? What happened then?
Well, what happened was connected with that experience through music that I talked about earlier on. And it was the discovery, not least through literature, through music, you know, through reading the novels by Dostoevsky, the poetry of Rilke, the novels of Hermann Hesse, to begin to learn that in fact what Christianity proposes and what the Catholic Church proposes is not a kind of idealized existence, a kind of fairyland existence, but is a radical form of realism, but infused with hope. So when in writing these books, I've tried to speak in such a way that they will be understandable to someone who sees faith from the outside like that. And that is one of the reasons why in both books I have made fairly consistent reference to works of literature, art, cinema, that aren't explicitly Christian at all, but that express something fundamental about what it is to be human. And then I try to say, well, let's look at this, and let's look at what Scripture can tell us about this, what the Church's teaching can tell us about this. Let's look at how we can make Christian sense of this. So both books, in a way, try to be bridge-building books between a universe of faith and a universe of unbelief.
So you found the answers to your questions?
I'm still seeking the answers, but I found the answer, who is Jesus Christ. And I'm still working out all the consequences.
What are the topics that you're dealing with?
Well, obviously in these two books, I try to say something about the deep existential pain that a human being can experience. And then in the other book, I try to say something about desire, about love, about sexuality. I try to reflect in some of my other works on the significance of woundedness and the possibility of healing. And I constantly try to reflect on what it means to choose fullness of life. You know, to turn our way, to turn our back on death. You know, in the Easter liturgy, we exclaim with a triumphant sort of joy, you know, death alone is dead, life is risen. Well, what does it mean to live on those terms? That's what interests me.
And do you have the answer?
As I said, I'm still discovering them.
Interesting. So what would you advise to the people who feel lonely, even within their own church communities or families?
Well, first of all, to be honest about their experience. Because I think many of us now do whatever we can to hide our loneliness. And, you know, our time renders that very easy through all sorts of social media. You know, we can carefully work on our Facebook profile or our Instagram, and we project an image of ourselves to the world which is successful, beautiful, relaxed, where we're always surrounded by beautiful people, always eating our favorite food, always elegantly dressed, etc. And so we have an opportunity now to project an idealized image of ourselves that just isn't true. So I think one of the most important things we can do is just to dare to be honest with ourselves. And if I feel lonely, to have the courage to say, I am lonely. Then to ask, is there anything I can do about it? You know, is my loneliness somehow the result of my own shutting the door to other people, keeping them at a distance? Are people frightened of me for some reason? Is there some reason why they may be unwilling to get too close to me? And then to ask, is there anything I can do to be of help, to be of use, to be of comfort to others? Because if I feel lonely, you know, the obvious thing I can do is to put the coffee machine on, to go and buy a couple of buns from the bakery, to open the door, and to invite someone in. So that's a very human response. A spiritual, supernatural response would be, you know, to go deep in prayer, to frequent the sacraments, to go deep into the liturgy, and to discover the reality of God in my life. But I think it's important to address the experience and trial of loneliness simultaneously at the human and at the spiritual level, and not try to just spiritualize it away.
So you write about the human being as a sexual being. So what are the questions and the answers that everyone is facing during the life, and what do you suggest to the people to solve them? How do they solve them?
Well, ultimately, I think the question of human desire and human sexuality and human longing, also in its most incarnate and embodied form, has got to be taken back to the most fundamental truth about what it is to be a human being. And that is, according to biblical revelation, the fact that we are made in the image of God to know and love God and to be like Him. That is to say that to be a human being and to reach fulfillment as a human being is only possible insofar as I rise towards a spiritual life where God becomes my everything. And that is also to acknowledge that any purely human experience of love, however ecstatic it may be, and however fulfilling it may be in the instant here and now, is limited, as any human perception is, by the transience of the here and now. You know, human experiences, human emotions, human desires do pass, whereas the desire for God has a mark of eternity and will carry us over into eternity. So that, even as I said, it's important to address the issue of loneliness in a way which isn't too spiritual, but also accounts for the human and incarnate. I think it's important to address questions of sexuality in a way which isn't exclusively embodied, but also leaves room for the spiritual. So I think that's the balance we need to find, to think of ourselves and to own ourselves as beings, one at the same time, of dust and of godlikeness.
So you also write about garment of glory or tunics of skin. What do these biblical images tell us about our current relationship with our own bodies?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because those are fundamental images that we owe largely to the Syriac Christian tradition. And it's important to remember that our religion, the Christian religion, is a religion with Oriental and Semitic roots. The notion of the robe of glory is one we find developed particularly in a Syriac father of the 4th century of great importance called Ephraim the Syrian. And for Ephraim, this image of the robe of glory is a way of speaking in images about what it means to be created in the image and the likeness of God. The robe of glory for Ephraim is that reflection of divinity that Adam and Eve, our first parents, the representatives of an ideal humanity, embodied before the fall, that is, before the virus, the disease we talked about earlier on, entered the system. And it's on account of the loss of this robe of glory that they found themselves of a sudden, having chosen not to put their trust in God's commandment, that they found themselves naked, reduced to their being of dust, and conscious suddenly of what they had lost. And that is where the other garment that you mentioned, the garments of skin, enter the picture. Because in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, always worth rereading and meditating on during Lent, we have the account of the fall, then we have the account of God confronting the human being with their disobedience and their loss of confidence in God's guidance and the fact of their sin. You have the announcement of their expulsion from paradise. But before they're sent away, and before the angel with a fiery sword is placed before the gate east of Eden, God, according to the scriptural narrative, towards the end of the 3rd chapter of Genesis, does this extraordinary thing. He makes for them garments of skin, which are a sort of rescue kit for negotiating life outside the Garden of Eden, in this hostile world where they have to earn their food and the sweat of their brow, and where they have to fight for existence. And the fathers develop this image of the garments of skin in a very beautiful way, because they say by clothing Adam and Eve in garments of skin as they leave Eden, the protected enclosure, and go into a hostile world, God clothes them with his mercy. And that is what our human condition now is like. It is life in a world that can often seem a hostile environment, but where we are clothed with mercy, and where mercy can warm us and protect us, and if we let it, refashion us.
Do you think that the end of the world is coming?
I am absolutely sure that the end of the world is coming. I have no idea when it is coming.
Some people say soon, very soon.
Well, but then people have been saying that for many thousands of years.
Yes.
So I think it's a good counsel to live at one and the same time as if the world were to end tomorrow, because that gives us a certain presence of mind, and at the same time to work as if it were to last forever, to try and construct something which is lasting and durable and beautiful and life-giving.
So we live in a culture that emphasizes the immediate gratification of desires. So how can the concept of chastity help younger generation build lasting and respectful relationships?
Well, I think it can help them because, in my experience, talking to young people, and having been a young person once upon a time,
you still are.
We realize that that promise just isn't a promise that can be fulfilled. That our deepest desires aren't satisfied. I can go for a long walk on a hot day, And I can think that the only thing I want is a cold beer. And the thought of the cold beer might obsess me and be the only thing that interests me there and then. I make my way to the nearest town. I sit down in the shadow of a tree. I order a beer, and it gives me immense pleasure and satisfaction there and then. I put the empty glass down, and then I want another one, and another one, and another one. Or I may find that actually this isn't what I want after all. And so the temporary satisfaction of a desire may lead me to discover, be it on that primary level of appetites of hunger and thirst, or in terms of erotic appetite, that actually, yes, there is something beautiful and gratifying here, but that there is also something deep in me that longs for more. And that is where the concept of chastity comes in and enters the picture. And the concept of chastity has often been misunderstood. And I think, the church and those who preach the teaching of the church, people like bishops and priests must take a certain amount of the responsibility for this, because more often than not, people think that chastity is about the denial of desire. Most people will presume that chastity is specifically about the negation of sex. Well, that isn't the case. Chastity is about something much more complex and much more interesting. In its root sense, the way the word emerged in Latin vocabulary, from which castus, castitas, we get our modern Latinate versions of the word chastity. The Slavonic languages follow a different course, but with a similar root. In antiquity, chastity stood for integrity. It stood for wholeness. And that's where it becomes interesting, I think, because our modern world that you referred to is a world that fragments society in so many ways and fragments our experience in so many ways. And we feel drawn in so many directions at once and just torn apart. And the notion of chastity, correctly understood, is an invitation to harmonize the different parts that make up my desires, my appetites, my longing, and to orient them in one direction so that they will take me to where I ultimately want to go.
So what would you advise someone who feels fragmented?
Again, I would advise, first of all, realism. Taking stock of things as they are. Trying to analyze my situation. Well, why do I feel divided? What am I torn between? And ideally, that sort of work is best done in conversation with somebody. If you can find someone wise and dependable, and someone who has a little bit of experience of life, who doesn't think it's always easy. So to take honest stock of where I am, and then to ask myself, well, where do I want to be? Where do I want to go? I think the most essential question we need to ask ourselves as human beings is, what is my deepest desire? What do I truly long for? Not just in the immediate term, here and now, of wanting the beer, of wanting the meal, of wanting this person, whatever it is. But what is the deepest driving force that is seeking expression in my sentiments, in my senses, and in my soul? And then to ask, what is the significance of that deep desire? And how can I reach that goal?
So who do you talk to when you are searching yourself?
Well, I am fortunate in having a couple of wise friends.
In a monastery or among the...
Also in monasteries. people who are wise both in terms of human depth and supernatural wisdom, and who are deeply biblically nurtured, and who are people of mercy and compassion and patience.
Mm-hmm. So what was the biggest challenge for you writing these books?
I think the biggest challenge was simply trying to be truthful, to account for what is a Christian ideal without compromising anything about the complexity of human experience, and always trying to regard that human experience of complexity with intelligence and with a compassionate understanding.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the findings that you wrote in the books are growing and you may change your views one day?
Well, so far I find I agree with myself. And you know, and what I try to set out in these books isn't just a, I mean, it isn't my subjective understanding of life's great mysteries, but it is a biblical understanding and the wisdom of the church, really. And I believe that is a very dependable and an exciting guide.
So is there another book coming?
Well, in fact, there already have been a few books after these ones.
Oh, really? And they talk about what?
Well, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Healing Wounds. That was a book that was commissioned as a Lent book. That is structured on a Cistercian poem from the 13th century, which is a contemplation of Christ crucified. And it is a meditation on the different parts. It is a very physical meditation on Christ's feet, on his knees, on his wounded hands, on his pierced side, on his breast, on his heart, on his face. So an intimate contemplation of God choosing for loving compassion to be wounded that we might become whole and healed.
So you became Trappist. We in Slovenia, we also had Trappist monks, but after the Second World War, the communists took their property, killed them all, took their knowledge, because our Trappists were keen to produce chocolate and liquors, so then actually they took everything. But what are your specifics? What are you keen to do? Is this a secret, as it was before? What's your...
I don't think we have any secrets. So.
Yeah.
A Trappist is, well, the word Trappist isn't really an official word. It doesn't exist in the church's official vocabulary. The order I belong to is called, in ecclesiastical terms, the Order of Cistercians of the Stricter Observance. So we are Cistercian monks, but part of a particular branch of the Cistercian movement that, with roots in the 17th century, a century of reform and renewal, aspired to a particular kind of fairly literal observance of the Rule of St. Benedict, which is the foundation of all monastic life in the West, really. So a Trappist doesn't aspire to be anything else than a Cistercian, but approaches that task with a particular kind of literalness, if you like. And so, you know, the way any family over time acquires its own particular history, its anecdotes, its wisdom, its glories and embarrassments. So the Trappist movement over 300-400 years has acquired its own history, its own spirituality. The word Trappist is simply related to a place name of the monastery of La Trappe in the northwest of France. So to refer to the movement as Trappist is simply to say that it has a connection with a reform movement that was going on at La Trappe in the 17th century and was continued.
So now in Slovenia you're visiting the Stična monastery?
Yes,
Yes.
which is a joy.
Yeah, with the Cistercians. And can we expect some Trappists to come here again in Slovenia?
Well, who knows? It has to be said that the present moment isn't a time of great expansion for the order. You know, as so many other religious orders, we see a vocational decline. We see monasteries closing or having to consolidate in fewer houses. So I don't really know any monasteries right now that are thinking of making new foundations. But who knows what might happen in 500 years.
Why is this happening, this decline?
Well, if I knew that, and if I could sum that up in a sentence, I would be a happy man. I think, you know, we are living now, I think it's pretty obvious to say, in a time of, you know, of great civilizational change. We are coming out of a period that in the West for the last 30 years or so has been proceeding with a great deal of enthusiasm and confidence in humanity's ability to fend for itself, in confidence in commerce and in trade, in human discoveries, in democratic development, in friendship between peoples. And now, in a very, very short time, really, we have seen so many of those optimisms, if not crushed, at least compromised, in as much as we see institutions collapsing, we see alliances that have defined societal development for decades shifting. We see a turn in the economic climate. And as a result, I think we see people asking new sorts of questions. And whereas, you know, not all that long, 20 years ago, a lot of observers would have taken it for granted that, you know, Christianity was dead in Europe and that was an evolutionary stage that belonged to the past. We now see a resurgence of young people asking very serious and well-motivated and persevering questions, and a new kind of awareness in the domain of faith and a new kind of readiness for commitment. So who knows what might happen? We see also a new vocational interest in the same way as we see a rise in the number of people who, you know, who devote themselves to one another in marriage. So I mean, throughout 2,000 years of Christian history, we have seen ups and downs and highs and lows in religious life. The last 20, 30 years have represented a bit of a dip. I think we have every reason to hope that we will see a resurgence, but when and how that will happen is fortunately in God's good providence.
So you're optimistic about the future?
I am hopeful about the future.
So you are now the Bishop of Trondheim in Norway. What kind of a job is that? Is it a difficult job?
It is an unpredictable job. You never know what's going to turn up, really. But it's a joyful job. I'm surrounded by very, very good people. And I'm astounded by the amount of goodwill that I encounter in people. The Catholic Church in Norway is a very variegated reality. It's an international, multicultural, multilinguistic reality. Just in my diocese, we have Catholics from 130 nations. So it is a great challenge to try and make a unity out of all that. But people do want that and are willing to work together. So what does my work consist in? Well, in prayer. You know, there is a liturgical responsory that we sing in the Common for Pastors, which commemorates holy bishops. And the responsory says he was one who prayed a lot for his people. And that is the bishop's primary task, to pray a lot for his people. And then he has the duty to teach and to preach, to celebrate the sacraments, to meet people, to have an open door, to go out and try and find people where they are, to try and listen to the sort of questions that are being asked in our times, and to propose answers, and generally to try and respond to whatever need emerges. And needs are manifold.
Do you have any message or advice for Slovenian bishops?
Oh, I wish I could give myself better advice. I don't think I'm in a situation to advise anyone else, but I think I believe in the truth of the gospel. I believe that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, and I believe in the transformative power of Easter. And I believe that the Church, in the deposit of faith entrusted to her, has the wisdom and the answers and the beauty and the compassion to respond to the deepest perplexities of our time. So I think what we need more than anything else is just to have confidence in what we've been given and in the God who calls us.
Mr. Erik Varden, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.
Hvala za pozornost. Nasvidenje.